Thank you. So yeah, so this is the part I extracted from one of my chapters in the thesis that deals with intergenerational mobility. And I just, for sake of this workshop, I extracted the part that deals with differences in the effect of mothers and fathers on the educational and occupational attainment of their children. So just to start to motivate the analysis, the presentation. So the figure on the left-hand side presents the educational status of children and their parents. The area that is marked here shows the proportion of children and parents with no education. So from these two bars, the one in the blue is for children and the one in the orange is for parents. From these 3 points are kind of evident. One is that educational status are low in Ethiopia, very low. About more than 40% of children do not attend any education, any formal education, and this is about 60% for their parents. And the second part is that children tend to have a better education than their parents, indicating that even though we started from a very low base, educational status are improving in the country. And three, from the pattern you see across no education, primary, secondary, tertiary education, you see that there is a strong correlation between child and parental education, and I will come back to that a little bit later. On the right-hand side are the patterns in educational status across rural urban areas, and you see that the bar in gray is for large urban areas, and the blue and the orange are for rural and the small towns. And so from this, the market area, you can see that large urban areas have a better educational status than rural and the small towns. The second graph is for occupation. It is exactly similar. It is similar to the one for education, but the patterns are the same for occupation. Again, children have a better occupational status than their parents, and unemployment or employment in less remunerating job is very high, both for children and their parents, and large urban areas offer a better quality job than rural areas and smaller towns. So based on the high correlation between child and parental education and occupation and the spatial variation in employment, I'm interested in this study to look at how urbanization and parental characteristics interplay to determine the educational and occupational status of children across space and over time. So the overall objective of this study is to look at the extent of intergenerational mobility in Ethiopia. This is interesting because intergenerational mobility, or mobility for short, tells the extent to which individuals could succeed regardless of the circumstances in which they were born. And the second objective is to look at how urbanization interacts with intergenerational mobility. It means whether children born in large urban areas perform better than children children brought up in rural areas or smaller towns. So the topic is important because intergenerational mobility signals the degree of equality of economic opportunities. Low mobility could be a cause and also a consequence of overall inequality. It exacerbates inefficiency, resource allocation, and dealing with this subject is important because it could inform policies that improves mobility, which in turn is vital to ensure long-term economic growth and shared prosperity. So I won't bore you with the data and variables, but I use LSMS data, and I first rank education and occupation of parents and children and then based on that, I do the analysis, but also for as an indicator of urbanization, rather than relying on the conventional administrative rural-urban classification, I generate these variables from a night light data, from which I then based on statistical method, I categorize areas into rural, small, and large urban areas, which have then interact to see how urbanization influences intergenerational mobility. Once the variables, the education and the occupation are ranked, and I then use a transitional matrix to see the percentage of children who acquire a better education than their parents, or occupation for the same. And then, because this would be an unconditional probability, and the education and occupation of individuals could also be influenced by several other factors, I then specify an ordered logit model to deal with this. But again, I won't bore you with this, but I invite you to read, please read my paper if you are interested in this. So going to the results, and again, I will only focus on the part that might be useful for the gender analysis. So this table shows the mobility in educational and occupational status. And the first panel, panel A, shows the percentage of children with a higher, the same or lower educational attainment than their parents. So the one that is indicated here, the area that is indicated here, shows that only 28% of children attain a higher educational status than their parents. This is very low compared even to other developing countries. And comparing column 2 and column 3, you see that this is even worse for daughters than for sons. The daughters are less likely to have a better education, and they are more likely to have a lower education than their parents. So the downside risk is higher, and the upward opportunities are lower for daughters than for sons. The same, you get the same conclusion for occupation also. Women are employed in less remunerating jobs. They are less likely to attain a good paying jobs, and more likely to have a low paying job than sons. But like I said, the previous table only is unconditional probabilities, and then I controlled for a lot of child characteristics, household characteristics, location characteristics, to try to tease out the correlation between child and parental characteristics. And this graph summarizes that result. So the graph, the line in blue and green, shows the probability of a child to have a secondary education and tertiary education. And across the x-axis, you see the different educational levels of parents. So you see that as the educational level of parents increase, the likelihood of a child to have secondary and tertiary education increases. And the broken red line is the likelihood of a child to have no education. And this declines as the education status of parents increases. Again, confirming that there is a very strong positive correlation between child and parental education. This shows about the same result, but for occupation. So it also summarizes that there is a strong positive correlation between the quality of employment of parents and the quality of employment of their children. So then coming to now, we have looked at parents together without disaggregating by gender. So here I disaggregate the parents into fathers and mothers and see how this interact with the education of their children. Column 1 and 2 compare how father's education affects the education of daughters and sons. So compare column 1 and column 2. You see that column 1, the coefficient in column 1 is larger than the coefficient in column 2, indicating that father's education is more important for daughters than for sons. Again, column 3 and column 4 compare the effect of mother's education for daughters and sons. you see that column 3 is for elementary and secondary education particularly is larger than the for sons, indicating that mothers' education is more important for daughters than sons. Now compare column 3 and column 1, which compares the effect of mother's education for daughters with father's education for daughters. Column 3 is larger, indicating that for daughters, mother's education is more important than father's education. And this one is about the same result, but for occupation. The first two columns compares daughters and sons' occupation against father's employment, and you see that father's employment is much more important for daughters than sons. Column 3 and column 4 compare mother's occupation for the occupation of daughters and sons. You see that column 3 is larger than column 4, and showing that mother's occupation is more important for daughters than for sons. Now again, compare column 3 with column 1, you see that mother's occupation is more important for daughters than father's occupation, particularly for self-employment. For skilled wage, its father's occupation is more important. So I'm not presenting it here. In my analysis in the thesis, I see that the main underlying factor for differences in occupational inequality is that there is a different access to education for women and men. When you account that, the differences in occupational inequality vanish, implying that if you want to promote girls' education, you have to give more education to mothers. And also, if you want to reduce inequality, especially in large urban areas, improve educational quality and educational access for girls and women. So in general, my study finds this evidence of substantially low intergenerational mobility, and this low mobility appears to be a common problem across sub-Saharan African countries from other studies. And like I said, low mobility promotes inefficiency and has adverse effect on economic development, social cohesion, and political stability. So policies should aim at addressing the underlying factors, like I said, the disparity in access to education and employment opportunities, particularly access to credit and the entrepreneurship skill training for women and girls. My analysis also indicates that low mobility results from the combination of difference in parental characteristics and location characteristics. Therefore, policies should target to reduce disadvantage related to parental characteristics and spatial inequalities. Thank you very much.